Hi, my name is Ahmad, and this is Exploration Radio, a podcast focusing on the past, present, and the future of exploration. On this week's episode, we're joined by...
My name is Bruce McDonald. I'm the Executive Vice President of Global Geochemistry for ALS Limited, an Australian traded company, a public exchange on the ASX. And I guess my role in the company is to look after the entire business of geochemistry, providing geochemical services to the exploration and mining industry worldwide.
A few decades ago, companies worked hard at developing in-house technical expertise. This allowed companies to directly benefit from any technological innovations developed by these groups. But over the last couple of decades, things have changed. Companies now largely outsource technical innovation to service providers. This means service providers are now best placed to provide technology solutions to the industry. And we have become their customers. We're now somewhat reliant on them to help us. So we wanted to get their perspective on what challenges they face when they're trying to sell these technologies to mining companies. And we wanted to know, have we been good customers? Now, the reason why we wanted to talk to Bruce and why we think he's perfect for this episode is because he has a really interesting background.
Yeah, look, I'm a geologist, but I've dabbled in a lot of different things. My first degree was geology. I have a master's degree in geology. I have an MBA. I've worked for years in exploration. That's where I started my career. Moved into mining operations as well. I've run mining operations. I've worked in the corporate office of major gold companies in the finance departments, and been the financial manager for one of them, Homestake Mining Company, a very good company historically, now gone. So I've dabbled in a lot of different elements of the industry, and it's given me a different perspective, I guess, than some who may have stayed in a single business line or career progression.
This episode is a continuation of an earlier discussion with Andrew Shook on whether the mining industry is an innovation laggard. Well, if we start off with the premise that we're a laggard industry, is it because we're not very accommodating to innovation? Or is it because we're not very good at it? Or do we just struggle to come up with innovative ideas or products? Let's find out what Bruce thinks. Now, I should mention that this interview was done almost a year ago on Skype, and some of the things that Bruce mentioned may not be entirely relevant anymore. Things like, today there is much better sentiment around investing in mining, and ALS no longer provides services to the oil and gas industry. Despite all that, the lessons we can learn from this interview are still valid today. So come join us and let's explore. So what brought you to ALS?
Oh gosh, what brought me to ALS? Well, I came to ALS back in about 2003. It was right as the industry was coming out of a very bad recession, and it looked to me that the business of mining was going to be resurgent, and I was interested in getting involved with a service company in this industry because of the things that you could do to create your future going forward in a business that has, what I've always said is a front end as well as a back end. You can create products. You're not stuck with a global price for a commodity. It's just a little bit more of a conventional approach to business than what you experience when you're working for, let's say, a gold mining company where you're selling at a world price and there's nothing you can do to make that better.
Can you unfold that a little bit more about how, say, a service provider is a little bit different than a mining company?
Yeah, okay. So, when you work in a mining company, in the operating side, you are dealing with two major elements. One is optimizing the extraction of the ore that you're trying to extract. The other side is minimizing your costs. And so the business has a number of dimensions to it, but you are stuck at the end of the day with the resource and the character of the deposit that you're dealing with at any one time. And that's a pretty finite space that you have to work within. When you're working in a service provider space, you actually have the opportunity to create products. And in doing so, you can add value to the process that your customers are engaged with and create your business as you go. And so there's one more dimension that you get to play with that you just don't have in a conventional mining sense.
So these products that you create, do you think they are a result of research and development, or are they? How do you create these products? What's the fundamental avenue of creating them?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's something we're grappling with right now. And I have to say, before I go any further, that our industry, not just mining companies, as you mentioned early on, but also the service providers in our industry have, none of us have been particularly creative, at least over the last 10 or 20 years. And so, there's not been a huge amount of change in our industry, unfortunately. But what we do is we're looking at making change. And I suppose if I was to go back in history, the major changes that have been seen in our industry, which is the provision of geochemical analyses, has had to do with the advent of increasingly proficient instrumentation that has allowed the simultaneous determination of many elements at one time, for example, that type of thing. So, there's been a lot of advances that have really lain in the physics of optical instrumentation, the physics of separating mass streams in a mass spectrometer, for example, that haven't had much to do with chemistry. It's much more been the physics of the instruments that we've been using. So from a technical point of view, I suppose one of the watershed moments for our industry in the last 25 years has been the introduction of ICP instrumentation that has suddenly gave people the ability to rather efficiently get many measurements of different elements all at one time.
So do you think in that time there's been any innovation in the type of businesses the service providers have run? Or do you think they've been kind of a very similar business model used by a lot of them?
Well, I guess our industry has gone from very much a cottage industry, mom and pop type of operations through the course of my career, to very much a globalized industry with fewer players. There's been a tremendous amount of consolidation. In the process of doing that, there's been a significant development of systems, systematization of processes, an increase in efficiency as well that has come along with that, that I think has provided some benefits to consumers, our customers, in the form of price reductions and things of that nature. But in addition, there's been a significant improvement in security of data, of information, as companies have gone from these small shops to significantly large companies with public ownership themselves and the requirement to do things properly and above board at all times. So we're suddenly it's been in the last few years, we're playing in the same ballpark that our clients are, with large distributed shareholdings, corporate governance processes, very much attending to health and safety procedures, all the same things that our clients have been concerned with, we are concerned with as well.
So would you say it's the same way that the mining industry has become more globalized, service providers had to follow suit and kind of do the same, from being maybe perhaps more localized to being more globalized?
Yep, I'd say that that's true, although the extent to which people have been able to assume that mantle has been somewhat variable. So, there's been some efficiencies provided through globalization where, at the very simplest level, large companies are able to share backroom functions and autonomize in doing so, but still provide, front-end operations that are quite separate and distinct from one another. And, that's one level of globalization that provides some benefits. But, our company is much more driven by globalized processes as well, and globalized controls with limb systems that operate simultaneously in a worldwide network. And so we try and keep that globalized approach in a far more all-encompassing sense than what I believe some of our competitors do. So there's different approaches.
So now, this is a question that I didn't send you beforehand, so you have the right to say you don't want to answer it. But one of the things I guess I was thinking about is if you look at the minerals industry and oil and gas, oil and gas industry tends to have these integrators, kind of like Halliburton and Schlumberger. Do you think is that something that's missing in mining? Could the mining industry use like a middle integrator that kind of serves maybe companies better as well as small providers better as well?
Yeah, there's a lot of fundamental differences between the oil and gas business and mining. I think that there's been a lot more concentration in terms of the industry evolution in the oil and gas industry. So we might look to that group to try and divine where the mining industry could go. But there are also some fundamental differences between the industries, and I guess foremost among them is the nature of a reservoir as opposed to the nature of a deposit in a mineral sense. You can do a lot of work from a very small number of points in the oil and gas business and get a significant amount of information that characterizes a reservoir that you can't do in a mineral deposit. And the reason that you can't do it in a mineral deposit and you can in oil and gas, I believe, is because the nature of a reservoir is you have permeability, you have an interconnection in the product you're wanting to extract through a large amount of space. It is essentially one transmissive body that has similar physical characteristics throughout. That's why you can extract it from a single point. Mining is a little bit different even when you're into solution extraction approaches. Mining is a little bit different because you have to extract every cubic meter one at a time. And there's no inherent transmissibility of characteristics from one point to another. In fact, they can be quite separate and distinct from one point to another. The occurrences of gold or any of the other metals you might want to extract can be quite distinct. And, the concept of encapsulation, silica encapsulation in a gold deposit, quite common. If you had that same concept of encapsulation in an oil and gas deposit, well, you just couldn't get any out. So there's a very strong distinction in their characteristics right there.
So fundamentally, then the product that you're designing technologies for is vastly different, in your opinion, between minerals and oil and gas then?
I think that there's parallels that you can draw between the two in terms of the evolution of the provision of services to some extent. But you can't carry the argument the whole way because there's a value proposition between the two that is quite different. And so while the value proposition can be carried a certain distance in oil and gas, it can't be carried usually as far in the mining industry. And that introduces breakpoints in the logic and breakpoints in how you might actually extend what you could imagine you could do from one industry to another.
So that brings a really interesting point that I guess in geosciences, we're kind of, we somewhat look to the oil and gas industry for ideas and innovations about how we would go in the future, with this assumption that oil and gas, from a geoscience point of view, is always a little bit ahead of us. So as a service provider to the minerals industry, do you have a benchmark that you work towards, or how do you foresee what the future structure of a service provider in minerals will look like? Or is that something that's done as a think tank in your company?
Yeah, okay. So, we're very engaged in innovation at the moment. We've got a number of significant project groups that are working on, 3 different areas of innovation, frankly. And so we're very much grappling with that very question at the moment. How do you go about imagining what the directions will be? We do, incidentally, have the advantage of being a significant service provider to the oil and gas industry. And so we're engaged in drilling services and all of the analytical approaches that are applied in the process of drilling services to the oil and gas industry. And so, we've got a bit of an insider view to what's being done in that industry. The fundamental characteristic from our point of view is that people working in the oil and gas industry will pay many multiples of a price that anyone in the mining industry would be prepared to pay. So that there's right away a finite limit that you can't go past in provision of many of the types of things that we see our oil and gas clients buying that we might entertain for minerals, but probably would never be able to get there. I guess the key for us is imagining how to adapt the intent of some of the oil and gas services that are delivered in that industry to the mining industry and create innovative products or outcomes that could be distinctly useful to a mining client. And then finding the right cost point that would make that efficient to deliver for an explorer to take up.
So from that point of view, is cost a major driver for your services to clients?
Oh, absolutely. Just looking at where we are in the industry evolution, in the last 4 years, a lot of demand for innovative services drowned. It was not really there at all. In fact, looking at our process of trying to acquire new work, the client's decisions were made almost exclusively around price. There were a few who were looking for advantage from the point of view of applications of science that were different and unique, innovations that would provide them competitive advantage, but they were very few and far between, and even then, price was a significant issue. Understand, because we were all under pressure.
So how much pressure does that put on you? So, obviously coming up with new techniques or innovative techniques is a costly enterprise. And then do you as a company find it hard to find new technological solutions because of the investment that might be required in coming up with them?
No, that's not where the problem lies. The problem lies in how to construct high potential projects and teams that can deliver outcomes that are meaningful in the directions we would like to go. We don't have problems imagining what we could do, which I guess I was surprised personally when we turned our minds to these things. We would develop a list of projects, maybe 10 or 15, and get to work on them. And I would think that perhaps we'd run to the end of the list and then, take another 10 years to think of another 10 or 15. It wasn't like that at all. One project would lead to 3 more. And so, the list just kept on growing and our ability to complete became more of the problem and prioritize the high potential projects from the low potential ones. And that is a distinct issue because you may be able to complete a project in terms of the technical problem that is posed, but converting that then to a success requires, that there's uptake on the other side, on the client side. And that was an early discovery for us where technical solutions arose. There was no one buying on the other side. And so there's a certain amount of willingness to take up innovation that we find to be sometimes lacking. And actually, there's a certain amount of I don't know what you'd call it, but fashionability behind the technologies people are willing to consider, as opposed to technologies that people would prefer to leave behind, even though they have significant application and historically have been well used. So, that's been an interesting discovery for us as we've gone through this process.
I think that's a fascinating point, that the development process of new technologies or new processes isn't the bottleneck. So if I'm getting that right, you're saying that it's the commercialization of a lot of that stuff from your point of view that ends to be a bottleneck?
Yeah, look, commercialization is always a challenge with any type of innovation that comes about, and I guess we've innovated our standard methods, for example, well-known methods, multi-element methods, provided additional levels of precision and accuracy, detection limits that hadn't been achieved before. These are things that are relatively easy to understand and are more readily picked up than other things. But, on the other hand, you have to convince clients that that the effort you're going to, which implies an additional cost, is worth paying for. And so to make it worthwhile, clients have to be able to identify an additional use for the data that they couldn't have achieved before. And for that to happen, there has to be innovation on the user end. There has to be some kind of, the users have to come to the party, in other words, to take that data and work with it in ways that perhaps they couldn't have before, extract more meaningful outcomes and realize an advantage because they've paid the price for it. And so there is a cycle involved that we can push towards, but past which we can't. We can show the advantages, we can, in terms of the technical performance of a method, but how that then translates into an end use, we really can only go so far.
That's a really interesting point.
Now, I don't think I really answered your question entirely, because part of your question is how hard is it to come up with innovations in hard times. And I suppose that's been another thing that was really fascinating to me, because, we hit that downturn in about 2013 when it started, and went through some significant layoffs. We laid off a tremendous amount of people, good people who were contributing well to our organization. And as we went through that process, realizing that we were losing skill sets as we did that, it became important for us to find ways to turn what was a very discouraging time into something positive. And so, given that some of our more talented people that we were determined to keep were now somewhat underused, we found that if we turned their attention to this type of project, we were able to extract some pretty significant benefits. And people who had great skill sets, who might have skipped to other industries, were suddenly reinvigorated in the process and were kept very satisfied working on brand new things no one had done before. And so for us, it became a really uplifting exercise in a very, very tough time, and delivered results for us within 12 months that began to pay dividends. And so we received benefit and were able to retain some people, not everyone by any stretch, in the process of doing this. And frankly, I think that it kept morale at a level that was unimaginable for the circumstances. And as I said, kept people engaged who might have left the industry otherwise. So it was very, very helpful to our company to get into that process at that very moment, as hard as it might have been from a financial point of view.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because that kind of goes in line with the well-used phrase of necessity is the mother of invention. So you obviously had, a desire to do something to try to keep people, and that led you down the path. So I think that's really, really interesting. And I also like your other point that, at some point, us as the industry, we also have to have the appetite for the stuff that you develop. Otherwise, the handover doesn't really work. You develop something, and if you don't have the appetite, then it just kind of sits in this limbo land where neither company or neither entity really wants to take it any further. So
yeah, and look, just as the way we go about our projects, we actually rarely will engage in a project without a significant client participating as an advisor and as a screener of the results, in other words. And so, we don't look for financial support in these things, but we look for active input from, people we view to be competent clients to help guide our efforts and gauge the results, with honest feedback. And so, we've done that with quite a number of our valued clients, and that's what's made these things work. There is, however, sometimes personal biases on the part of individuals who participate, ourselves included, where you start pursuing an idea with great intentions, believing that it will be fantastically useful, and you still fall prey to the conventions of what is hot in our business today and what is not. It has nothing to do with efficacy, proven performance. There's just some things that you can't sell today.
So can we talk a little bit about how you measure return on your investment in technology? Do you need a certain percentage of the industry to take it up to kind of meet your costs? If you're going down the path of developing something new, how do you measure its ultimate effect to the business, to your business?
Look, we probably don't take an approach that would be considered to be best practice. Frankly, what we do is ad hoc. We work with our R&D process through people who are also engaged in the operating elements of our business. So we don't have a defined R&D group. We don't have R&D cost centers. The areas, locations that are doing the development in our system tend to be the major operating locations with the individuals who are best suited from an expertise point of view to conduct a development exercise, and also locations where they have enough of a financial margin to be able to cover the costs, and it's absorbed in operations. So we're not measuring the cost of our R&D as we do it. It's not a continuous effort, although frankly we've never stopped doing research and development. We don't have any individuals who are devoted to it full time. We define projects at a very high level. When I say that, I mean I'm personally engaged with all of these projects and lead them all. That's not to say that I actually do any of the R&D, but I am screening the projects. I'm making sure that the individuals who are engaged have the time free so that they can pursue these things and they're not consumed by operating responsibilities. So I do try and carve some time out around their R&D exercise. I track the projects to make sure that progress is going on and look for outcomes that I believe will be meaningful to the company at the end of the day. So that's how we run them. When you talk about measuring the business outcomes, our primary gauge is whether or not we are getting inquiry from our client base around new methods and technologies. Because if we're not getting that inquiry, then it's probably because we're not providing anything that's seen as innovative. And as soon as that happens, then we become worried that we're not advancing. And so, our primary measure of success is feedback from clients and the character of that feedback.
So in saying that, how important do you think research and development is to your company? Do you think it's a fundamental part of your business, or do you think it's a thing that you do when you have excess capacity, or
okay,
how do you define it?
So I've been with this company now for 13 years, and I'd say for the first 5 years I was with the company anyway, we didn't do a lot of R&D. We were very much sticking to our knitting, looking for innovation from our own suppliers, ironically. And that is how things had changed over time up until that point. New instrumentation, new capabilities from instrumentation is what gave groups like ours the innovation to pass along to clients. So yes, a mining company could say our suppliers are innovating, but it actually wasn't coming from a first-order supplier. It was coming from a second-order supplier, if you know what I mean. Today, it's a very different story. Today, the dynamics of our industry are such that I think we're going through a technological revolution. And I think that's been more and more apparent over the last 2 or 3 years, to the point where today, I think if you're not innovating and looking for ways to take on new innovative approaches, your days are probably numbered, whether you're a supplier or a miner for that matter, because there's some really exciting and fundamental change happening in our business that I think is going to drive the next wave of discovery. And I think that's made innovation an absolutely fundamental cornerstone of what we have to do as a supplier today. And so it's become an important part of our strategy.
So I guess we've talked a little bit about that. There is a bridge between the technologies you develop and how well they're taken over by clients. Do you care to comment why the industry is so hesitant in taking up new technology?
Well, I mean, you could answer that simply by bringing up the character of our economic climate for the last 4 years. I mean, there's been a dearth of new money in the mining industry that has fueled, exploration or any kind of innovation in the business. Mining companies have been very focused on costs to the exclusion of all else, and for good reason. And so that really put a damper on innovation. I suppose one of the things that you do see when you come up with new approaches is that you may see a new line item in an exploration budget, and a new line item in an exploration budget up until very recently has been a very unwelcome thing. So that has stifled change. However, as I mentioned, I think there's been a growing perception by many in the industry that approach, that attitude, really has to change. And so I think that we will see people embarking on probably conservative spends geared towards new technology, new applications of science that can help the discovery process. And I think that the rate of that adoption of new things will increase over the next 3 to 5 years at a dramatic pace.
Wow, that's pretty interesting. So you think that the future of the industry, both from, say, your client base as well as your company, will look fundamentally different than it looks right now?
I think it'll look very different. I think from a mining company point of view, I think that the technology-driven components and the resource reserve engineering processes will become much, much more sophisticated. And I think that'll be a huge benefit to the parties that can get on board early and become real experts at that process. There's tremendous value to be delivered in that area. So having said that, our business, the business of provision of geochemical services, is likely to change very dramatically as a result.
Do you care to comment how?
Well, I mean, it's yet to be seen, but I think that there will be a lot of focus on non-standard analytical approaches. Things, okay, we could put it as simply as this. For years now, companies like ours have been generating multi-element results of up to 50 elements for companies to take and use in the exploration and resource definition process. By my estimation, of those 50 elements that people would be extracting from our analytical service, maybe 5 see any real constructive concentrated use. The rest, frankly, I'm not sure that anyone really knows how to begin to use them. And so that's not to say that they're not important. Far from it. I think that, we've just not been able to grapple with the data density behind all of the indications that those additional elements provide. And that has been the problem so far. The luxury has been there that we haven't had to deal with those problems. But as discovery rates drop and the imperative becomes greater, I think we're going to have to get a lot better at dealing with those extra elements, the extra data points that lie within the analyses we're paying for, and all of the indicators even outside of geochemistry, that go along with. And it's really not just the discovery process I'm talking about that would be the beneficiary either. It's the milling processes, the beneficiation of the ore itself, right through to the responsible comportment of waste, and how we deal with waste. Whether we put things into large conventional tailing dams that have obvious hazards associated with them, or deal with them in more intelligent ways. Environmental concerns that come along with waste piles and debris piles of all sorts need to be better managed, and they can be better managed if we know more about the materials we're disposing. And so those types of things, I think, will give huge value.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think the amount of data that we've produced hasn't quite been replicated to the amount of knowledge that we've taken out of that data, and that gap has got bigger and bigger in recent times, anyways. And I think the Element Suite is a great example of that. We have far more data from a geochem point of view, but our understanding and our knowledge or our ability to use it hasn't quite caught up to the same level.
No, that's right.
I think those are pretty much all the questions I had, Bruce, and I think that was a great discussion.
It's been a pleasure talking to you.
I think it's really good to get your insights on, essentially as an outsider looking in. You were an insider at one point, and now you get to look from an outside in and then see what we're doing. So that's great.
No, that's right. Well, thank you very much, Ahmad, for the opportunity to talk to you.
In our opinion, outsourcing of intellectual capital to service providers has resulted in a structural problem. When it comes to technical innovation, who is prioritizing it? Who is influencing the outcomes? Service providers are now the very people we need to listen to. Now, I am sure some individuals will see this differently. But put your whole industry hat on for a second. There are bigger issues than at a company or individual level. Who is leading who? Are we rudderless? It sure as hell feels like it. At the end of the day, service providers are restricted in what they can do, not what they can imagine. And the reason for that restriction is us. Our willingness to take up innovation is the key issue here. We have to start realizing the long-term value that an innovation can provide and not focus on the short-term cost of it. And we have to acknowledge the role that cyclicity of the industry plays in this. In booms, we usually don't have time to innovate because we need to get shit done. But in a bust, we're too concerned about everything costing too much. So when do we have time to innovate? On top of all of this, service providers now also have to take the financial risk of commercializing technological innovations. But do you think it's fair that we burden them with this risk and then complain about the cost of it when they try to sell it back to us? It seems like innovation is on everyone's lips these days. So we leave you with a question. Is your company innovative? If not, why not? Exploration Radio is brought to you by Steve and Ahmad. Our producer and all-round go-to guy is Dan Hershowitz. This podcast is recorded at the Perth Music House. If you'd like to know more about Exploration Radio, check us out on explorationradio.com. Or you can also find us on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn. And as always, if you like this podcast, please review us on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Until next time, let's keep exploring.